So special for me, first of all, to just have something that reminds me of where I come from, of my country and my culture out there on court, because I feel like that's what makes me special, is where I come from. And obviously, everything else, how I play and my fight. The flower in the hair was an idea of Nike.
$75 million. Let that number sit for a second. Not for Serena. Not for a slam champion with a decade of dominance under her belt. Not for someone whose name your grandmother already knows. For a 20-something from the Philippines who, not long ago, people were still describing as one to watch. The moment that figure leaked onto the internet, something shifted. Not just in headlines, not just in boardrooms, but in locker rooms, in press conferences, in the quiet conversations players have when the cameras are off. Because in professional tennis, money is never just money. It is a signal. And Nike just sent the loudest one in years. Before we get into what that signal means, let us talk about who Alex actually is, because if you only know her from the deal, you are missing the real story. Alex grew up shaped by a country that was falling in love with tennis at exactly the right time. She speaks about it openly, about how the sport exploded in the Philippines, how fans did not just follow her but followed the game itself, how a whole generation started picking up rackets and caring about Grand Slams in a way they never had before. She did not just benefit from that wave. In many ways, she became its face. And the thing about Alex that people keep coming back to, whether it is coaches, opponents, or fans who meet her for the first time, is that she is not performing anything. There is no carefully crafted media personality sitting on top of the real person. What you see is what you get. She cries when it is hard. She fights when she is down. She talks about her country, her community, her family, with a warmth that does not feel like a talking point. It feels like the truth. And in a sports world absolutely saturated with polished athletes who have been media trained within an inch of their lives, that kind of authenticity lands differently. It cuts through. So when Nike looked at Alex, they did not just see a tennis player. They saw something rarer. They saw a story that people actually want to follow. Now, the deal itself. $75 million. Reports began surfacing in early 2026 and they pointed in the same direction from multiple sources. This was not a renewal in the traditional sense. This was a repositioning. Nike was not just keeping Alex in their stable of promising young athletes. They were elevating her to a different tier entirely, the kind reserved for athletes who transcend their sport and become something closer to cultural icons. She was brought to Nike's world headquarters in Oregon, not as a guest, not as a visitor on a tour, but as a centerpiece. Her image appeared on the Nike app alongside athletes who had spent years building that kind of platform. And then came the collection. The Sagwa Storm line, inspired by the national flower of the Philippines, blending heritage and identity with modern athletic design. This was not a merch drop. This was a statement of intent. Nike was not just betting on Alex the tennis player. They were investing in Alex the symbol, the bridge between global sport and a market they very much want to reach. And that is where things started getting complicated inside the tour. Because other players noticed. Of course they did. You cannot drop a number like 75 million into a sport and expect nobody to react. Some reactions were quiet. A few were not. The frustration did not always have a name attached to it, but you could hear it in interviews if you listened carefully. Players who had been grinding for years, stacking up wins, climbing rankings the hard way, suddenly found themselves in a conversation about whether performance still mattered as much as perception. And look, that is a genuinely uncomfortable question. Because the system everyone was trained to believe in, win more, rank higher, earn more, was visibly bending. Here was Alex, without a major title, without a decade of dominance, landing a deal that would make most Grand Slam champions do a double take. And the honest answer to why that happened is not simple, but it is worth breaking down. Nike does not spend $75 million on hope. They spend it on data, on market analysis, on projections built from years of watching how global audiences move and what makes them stop scrolling. And what they saw in Alex was a convergence of factors that almost never line up this cleanly. She has a fan base that does not just support her, it mobilizes. Filipino fans do not casually watch Alex play. They travel. They fill sections of stadiums with flags and noise and genuine emotional investment in a way that tournament directors have been raving about. At the Australian Open, there were 4 women from Southeast Asia in the main draw simultaneously. That alone shifted the demographic of who was watching, who was buying tickets, who was suddenly discovering the WTA. Alex was at the center of that shift. Add to that the fact that she is left-handed, technically one of only 5 lefties in the WTA top 50, which sits right at the statistical average for the general population but creates a very specific kind of challenge on court that opponents have to solve differently every single time. She takes the ball early, redirects with sharp precision, and competes with a mental composure that players and coaches who have faced her consistently remark on. She is not just a story. She can actually play. And that combination, the marketability and the game, is what convinced Nike this was not a risk. It was an investment with a long runway. But here is the part that nobody was quite prepared for. When the deal was confirmed and the world started paying attention to what Alex was actually doing with the money, the narrative shifted again. Because Alex did not do what most people expected a young athlete to do with a sudden influx of generational wealth. There were no headlines about luxury purchases, no social media flexing, no performative display of arrival. Instead, the story that emerged was quieter and somehow far more powerful. She used part of her earnings to buy her parents a home. A peaceful place that reflected the years they had sacrificed while she chased a dream most people thought was too ambitious for too long. That single decision did more for her public image than any marketing campaign Nike could have designed. Because suddenly, criticizing the deal felt mean. It is one thing to debate whether a sponsorship reflects sporting merit. It is another thing entirely to scrutinize someone who just made sure her parents have a roof over their heads because she remembered where she came from. The players who had been quietly skeptical found themselves in an awkward position. The conversation could not just be about the money anymore because the money had a face on it, and that face was someone buying her family a home. So the criticism went underground. It became more coded. Post-match interviews where certain players leaned harder on results when discussing endorsement value. Analysis segments where the debate about marketing versus merit suddenly felt more urgent. None of it was really about Alex. All of it was about what Alex represented, which is the fact that the rules of the game were changing and not everyone had gotten the memo at the same time. The WTA has spent years trying to grow its global footprint, trying to reach audiences beyond the traditional tennis markets of Europe and North America. That effort was working, slowly. And then Alex arrived with a built-in audience that spans Southeast Asia, a region with enormous population, growing purchasing power, and a genuine hunger for sporting heroes they could claim as their own. Tennis was already popular in the Philippines. But Alex turned it into something closer to a national obsession. Every match became a shared moment. Social media in the country would light up during her games in a way that tournament organizers, broadcasters, and sponsors all noticed and wanted a piece of. This is what Nike understood before most people even started paying attention. They were not just signing a tennis player. They were buying a door into a market that was ready to open. And the $75 million was the price of the key. Now let us talk about the on-court reality, because this story does not work if the tennis is not real. And the tennis is very real. Opponents who have faced Alex describe a specific kind of problem she creates. The lefty angle alone forces adjustments that most players spend their careers not having to make. The way she takes the ball early and redirects pace means you cannot rally your way to comfort against her. She is aggressive without being reckless, and she competes with a calm that makes her feel bigger than her ranking suggests. She has beaten top players. Not once, not in a single magical week, but consistently enough that nobody who follows the tour dismisses her as a product of hype. There is something genuine happening with her game, and the coaches and players who work around her know it. One former top player, watching her push a highly seeded opponent to the absolute limit in a 2026 US tournament match, said out loud what a lot of people were thinking, that we are going to see a lot more of her. Not as a courtesy, as a reading of the situation from someone who knows what it looks like when a player is on the verge of something. The spotlight that came with the Nike deal did not slow her down. If anything, it seemed to clarify something for her. She kept training, kept competing, kept showing up with the same focus that defined her before the headlines arrived. And that consistency became its own kind of message to everyone watching. Because the players who crumble under increased expectation usually do it early. The fact that Alex kept moving, kept grinding through the additional scrutiny, told the rest of the tour something important about who they were actually dealing with. Meanwhile, the visibility kept building on itself. Her name in a tournament draw generated engagement that players ranked well above her could not match. Clips from her matches traveled across platforms in ways that felt almost algorithmic, but were actually just the natural result of an audience that was hungry and vocal and genuinely invested. Practice footage pulled views. Behind-the-scenes content pulled views. Even simple match highlights would circulate for days. That is not manufactured. That is a fan base with energy and nowhere to put it except toward her. And this created a feedback loop that became increasingly difficult to ignore at the tour level. The more fans watched, the more platforms promoted her. The more she was promoted, the more new people discovered her. The more people discovered her, the louder the noise got around her matches. Tournament directors started talking about her attendance numbers. Broadcasters started prioritizing her scheduling. The infrastructure of professional tennis started quietly reorganizing itself around the fact that this particular player moved the needle in ways that were becoming too significant to treat casually. And that reorganization was not lost on the other players. Some responded by trying to build their own brands more aggressively, experimenting with social content, becoming more accessible in press settings, trying to manufacture a version of what Alex seemed to generate without effort. Others doubled down on performance, operating on the belief that results would eventually demand the attention they deserved. Both strategies made sense. Neither came with a guarantee. Because what Alex had was not just a brand or just results. It was timing. She was rising at precisely the moment when the sport needed a new story, when the market was ready to expand, when a new generation of fans from new parts of the world were looking for a reason to care about women's tennis. And she fit that moment with an almost uncanny precision. The $75 million deal was not the beginning of this story. It was the moment the rest of the world caught up to what was already happening. Nike did not create Alex's momentum. They recognized it early, backed it heavily, and are now along for a ride that nobody can quite predict the destination of yet. And that uncertainty is actually the most compelling part of all of this. Because if Nike is right, this deal will look conservative in 10 years. Every win she adds, every milestone she crosses, every Grand Slam draw where she goes deep, will compound the value of the investment in ways that make $75 million feel like an opening bid. But if the tennis stalls, if the results plateau before the promise is fully realized, then this becomes one of the more fascinating cautionary tales in modern sports marketing. The spotlight that came with the deal would cut both ways, and every loss would carry the weight of the investment behind it. That is the pressure Alex lives with now. Not just the pressure of competing at the highest level, which is already enormous, but the additional weight of being a symbol, of carrying the hopes of a nation, of representing a shift in how the sport understands its own audience and its own future. And yet, when you watch her, you do not see someone buckling under that weight. You see someone who seems to genuinely understand the moment she is in, who has not been destabilized by the noise around her, who still goes to practice the same way she did before anyone knew her name. That groundedness, that refusal to be consumed by the hype, might actually be the most impressive thing about Alex right now. Not the deal. Not the fan base. Not the collection named after a flower from her homeland. The fact that through all of it, she still just looks like someone who really loves tennis. And the rest of the tour is watching. Some with motivation, some with frustration, some with genuine admiration. But all of them are watching. Because at this point, you would have to be living entirely off the grid not to be curious about where this is going. The storm the collection was named after has not fully arrived yet. What we have seen so far is just the weather changing.